Hi, this is Paul. Oh yeah, I got this on. They're not going to a bank. People are gonna think I'm robbing it. But got the Brett Weinstein bandana thing going, and the raining in Sacramento hat, and walking to work in the rain because, well, the homeless people already know I'm here, so it's the way it goes. But I want to do a little bit more commentary on this podcast with Eric Weinstein and Daniel Schmachtenberger. Really interesting podcast. Talk about Plan B on avoiding apocalypses. Now, again, as apocalypse is basically the English translation for, well, it's kind of the Greek. English translation is really revelation. There's a lot of revelation going on in this, or maybe a lack of revelation. You can decide. What I appreciate about this is perhaps it's Calvinism beneath the surface, that humanity has painted itself into a corner, and there is no one to blame but us. And if you look at Eric Weinstein's menu tree that he talked about in the last one, yeah, there's all of these options leaving, and they all seem to lead to death. I was trying to catch up on a little bit of Better Call Saul. I'm still in the Netflix phase in the last season on Netflix. And yeah, Netflix is sort of the canons of Dort of television. Or not Netflix, but Better Call Saul is sort of the canons of Dort of television, because you look at Slippin' Jimmy, and he can't stay away no matter how many breaks he gets to and opportunities to fly right. And so I just love the way the character is developed amongst all the other characters, and maybe I'll do a video on Better Call Saul at some point. Breaking Bad was excellent too. We are a suicidal species. This gets pulled out in the Matrix movie. Agent Smith makes that observation. In Terminator 2, the Terminator makes that observation about us. We are a suicidal species. Yet the Weinstein brothers, Weinstein world saving continues, and they want to save the world for us, in spite of us. It's very unlike anti-natalism, and there's something very heroic about this, and it's virtually messianic. Karen made a comment that, she just is always bothered listening to Eric because he always sounds like, well, the world would be fine if we just listened to him. And I said, yeah, but that's sort of like eating in a diner in New Jersey. If you love the food, and you just have to accept that the grease that comes with it. It's just part of the package with Eric. And so Brett, of course, and I've talked about this many times over the past few years. Brett, of course, with his description of the assassin robot and this insane spelling bee. And this has come out, and I've only watched the first of his, he and his wife's conversations about the coronavirus. I thought it was an excellent video. But, this insane DNA spelling bee where spelling, I love to, I thought about doing a video on that one, how, DNA is trying to get itself into the future. It's just rife with all of the conversations that we've been having. But then, of course, well, the assassin robots have to reprogram themselves to not be assassin robots. Well, how could an assassin robot do that? Then you have the problem of who is we? Well, we can just transcend our programming, really? The assassin robot can transcend its programming? What if the assassin robot doesn't really have much of a clue about what the assassin robot is doing because it's just an assassin robot? And so how can the species be saved from itself? So Schmachtenberger at least sees that it's not so much a hardware problem as a software problem, and I think that's an improvement. And we see that this is fundamentally, as I pointed out in the last video, this is fundamentally a religious conversation. Now, the really poor definition of religion as to that which has to deal with supernatural things is sort of what's limiting the observation among the people that, they're participating in a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. Philosophy, yes, but very much religious. Now, the terms of secularism are that we must exclude any conversation partner who isn't an assassin robot. Well, that kind of makes it difficult to figure out how we can transcend our assassin robot programming unless, well, the Heidelberg Catechism weighs in and says you need someone who is fully human and fully divine. And I couldn't help but think about that as I was thinking about the dilemma that they're having in secularism of, well, we have to transcend our assassin robot programming, but only assassin robots can wade in to how this programming can be transcended. And I got a hat trick to Patrick Wagner, who's a regular commenter on the channel, who stuck in a Chesterton quote. He often sticks in Chesterton quotes, but this one really grabbed me. So you get a grade A on colonizing Paul Vanderklay this week. Because I said, well, where's that from? And he said, Heretics. And I've got Heretics on my hard drive, and I've got it in my Audible collection. So let's pull out some more Heretics and listen to them by good old G.K. Chesterton. And see, my low status has its advantage, so be careful about wishing it away, all you folks who think that someday I'll have 1 million subscribers. Chesterton, oh shoot, I didn't even do the commenting on the... Oh, no, first we gotta play the video, and then we can read Chesterton. See, we are strange kinds of assassin robots that aren't really too tuned into ourselves. So let's jump in. Let's jump in here.
As some time. Here are the things that really disturb me about it. One, you don't have to grimace. I mean, I want to.
I'm not grimacing. I'm smiling.
Okay. One is what is the minimal level of violence and coercion needed to bring about some of these changes? So this was something that I brought up in my discussion with Peter Thiel, and his and my sort of somewhat mutual framework. Really, I learned something from him, but I tried to put my own thing back into it. Is take a beautiful dream, ask what the minimal level of violence and coercion needed to accomplish it, add that in as part of the cost, and ask yourself, is it still beautiful? So that's one of the questions that I would ask you.
And it's a really good question.
And then I get to the issue of certain things like lakefront property, in the atomic world anyway, are valuable and unique, and it becomes problematic to imagine a world in which all of our previous experience was about competing for these things.
And this is where we get to really the nub of Schmachtenberger's desire to, what we have to do is get rid of rivalry. And so eventually he'll mention Buddhism because, of course, well, if we can get rid of desire, we can get rid of rivalry because we won't desire. But at some point you then have to ask, well, is life worth living without desire? So we can have the necessary amount of desire without it triggering our assassin robot programming to go ahead and do bad things to each other.
To imagine 100% adherence to this new way of thinking.
Well, let's go protopian, not utopian. Let's go that there are some...
Say what you mean by protopian.
Moving in the right direction.
All right.
Hi, guys are always making up new words, but go ahead.
Let's say that there are some things that are harder to make adequately abundant than other things, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can start moving, and as we do it, we will get... There's good reason to think that there is a basis to do that in more areas.
Now, what strikes me when I hear him say this is there's this great passage at the beginning of C.S. Lewis's the Great Divorce, where someone on the bus, one of the sad, miserable, ornery characters on the bus, gets up to the other world and wants to take something back with them into the old world because they figure that hell can be reformed if there's only scarcity, and what you need is scarcity for the economy to get going, and then hell can be transformed. And what's interesting is now you see sort of the opposite, in that, well, if rivalry is the problem, well, why don't we, it's basically it's basically the parental strategy of, well, if the kids are all fighting over the last ice cream cone, make sure that you always have enough ice cream cones for everyone. And in many ways, this is sort of this is the affluence model, and this is the affluence answer. And if we can have make everyone affluent, then they'll be more peaceable. And there's a certain amount of truth about this. Peterson, of course, mentioned that, it's not necessarily income inequality that make people violent. It's the delta between the people and how close they are to each other. If you have a great deal of income inequality and they're right next door to each other, that's when you have problems. But if everybody's sort of poor and in it together, or everybody's sort of rich and in it together, well, then you've got a little bit less rivalry. And so now it's helpful here to note that all of these, this is going to become a theme in this video, that all of these answers work pretty well. They're moderately scalable. They'll maybe get rid of 80% of your problem, but the last 20% is critical. But the last 20% is often the thing that will do you in. So, so this is the affluent way around, the mass production way around rivalry, that if everybody is angry for ice cream cones, then, well, make sure that there are enough ice cream cones, and then everybody will be happy.
So in a system where when something is more scarce, it is worth more, then if I'm on the supply side of that, I have an incentive to manufacture artificial scarcity. And to definitely prevent abundance that would debase the value of the thing that I have.
So in other words, don't let Apple make an iPod and have all those, really cool white earbuds and have Bono and because basically Apple's whole business model is to, I'm going to get my trouble. Why am I wading into the Apple Windows or Apple Android thing? The whole point of desirability is the more you pay, the more it's worth.
In a world where we remove the association of value and scarcity, then where there are actual scarcities, the goal is to engineer the scarcity out of the system. Mm-hmm. And so if we're talking about limited amount of oceanfront, then this is where we say, well, can we do seasteading and create a lot of oceanfront that is really awesome, where there is actually more desire. Just like if more people are shopping at the store, then we need more shopping carts. And so part of the answer is how do we actually increase the abundance, but not an exponential abundance, because we're talking about also steady state population and using in a lot of shared resources.
We should, however, pause and remember the fact that a lot of these apocalyptic nightmares have been the result of actually using this strategy to get us out of class warfare. That if we can just make Africa and Asia middle class, then the world will be nice. But, of course, you have the problem that 8 billion people can't all live like 200, 300 million Americans are living now. And you can't have one car per person. And you can't have all of these things that we're used to eating. And we can't all drink all this milk and have all this beef and so on, and all eat meat and so on and so on. And this is an old argument. I remember back in the 70s, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger was, Ron Siders wrote this book that, really turns, my little corner of Christianity on its head, and, everybody stopped eating meat. And, that's why when I watch all of this stuff happen today, it's like, nothing, there's nothing new under the sun. I've seen this all in the 70s, getting back 50 years ago. I watched all this in the 70s. I'm an old man, get off my lawn. But that's, so the engineering scarcity, well, we're going to have to scale up and get rid of scarcity, so then people won't, start to envy each other and hate each other and on and on and on.
And it's that coupled with psychologically healthier, more mature people that relate to these things differently. Both of them.
And what really, so part of what I chuckle about when I listen to this is because if you've been part of a church environment, many of these problems have been abundantly clear for much of your lifetime. Well, if only we had mature, responsible, better people, then, well, yeah, But isn't that the product of what your system is supposed to produce? If only people were better, then they wouldn't be assassin robots. But we're assassin robots. So, or we're only acting like we're not assassin robots because we have plenty, unless and until something happens, and then the knives come out and the teeth come out, and off we go. So, and it's so funny because you see this in churches, because what you'll have in a church, in a small community like a church, that, especially in an urban area where maybe not everybody is married to each other, or not everyone is a blood relative to each other. In rural communities, you'll tend to have churches where those dynamics, especially in a church like the Christian Reformed Church with all of these immigrants, where that tends to be true. But you've always got some of these people over here who are more mature and more reasonable, and these are sort of the ideal people. Then you've got these other people who are not acting ideally. Well, if only these other people would if only these other people would be like them. Okay, well, how are we going to make them like them? Well, we'll talk at them once a week. Okay, we'll talk at them once a week. Will that fix it? Well, not really. Well, we'll have small groups, and then it'll be life on life, and that'll help. Or then we'll hire a counselor, and the counselor will do a whole lot more listening to them and maybe talk them into being mature people. And, again, all of these things sort of do help a bit, but in the end, we've still got a hierarchy. And it's that hierarchy that not just of goods that can be manufactured, but it's the hierarchy of human beings that causes a lot of this stuff.
Those are necessary. Neither would be sufficient on their own.
Well, I like that a lot. And I do, quite honestly, take some hope in that. I'm finding that what people are now rivalrous about has changed a lot, I think, over the course of my life.
That's because we've gotten a lot more affluent. And if anybody's, as the stories are about to show, Eric Weinstein is living in a very affluent among a very affluent group of people now, far more affluent than me or just about everybody else listening to this podcast.
I think millennials are much more interested in what experiences have you had recently rather than what have you bought and purchased recently.
That's because there's been a hierarchy and everybody has the same thing. And so everybody has an iPhone and everybody has nice clothes and everybody has this and everybody has that. So now it's all about experiences.
In part because the economy kind of turned against them, but travel got cheap. Right. And so
they still have a lot of stuff, a lot of them. But again, we've got hierarchies here and inequalities.
That's been interesting to see. Do you believe that we have a huge, nearly universal level up in maturity and wisdom available to us through development hacking?
And
as opposed to church or counseling or education, or you see, the truth is we've been monkeying about at this for a very long time.
So it is both how we develop that socially, which I don't think will happen uniformly. I think will happen in pockets that become strange attractors that other groups want to then implement once seen.
And now, both of these guys, I think, have a pretty good handle on a fair amount of human nature, as I'll call it. Now, again, I'm a Calvinist, and I'm talking, and I'm a Christian, and talking about a sinful human nature, but that's a really optimistic perspective, especially at a time when, suddenly, the economy's crashing and we're heading towards a economic slowdown, the likes of which we've not seen in 100 years at least.
As they're so clearly better at both quality of life and innovation. And how long that takes to develop widely is a while. Like, this is a multi-generation thing.
Okay.
I think that would not be sufficient on its own, but it's necessary. Better sense-making systems where we can actually solve problems without causing worse problems, which we're not historically good at, is also necessary.
And there's a certain amount of Captain Obviousness in some of these things. Like we need to do better because we really need to do better. So better. Let's agree that better is better than less better.
And this is both some evolution in our epistemics and our actual processes of collective sense making and collective coordination.
We certainly have added fancy words to this whole thing.
So yes, I see level ups in both of those possible.
All right. Now I'm going to ask a very difficult question, but we have to get to it.
Yeah.
In essence, I've got a riff, which I don't think I've said publicly, which is that the biggest problem with discussing sexuality is that sex is sexy.
Yeah.
And if you have something that's central to the world that is almost impossible to talk about,
yeah,
it's a very strange state of affairs. Assume that we solve all of these problems that don't have to do with status, sex, and reproduction, according to your most optimistic scenario. But we have trouble over here, that there's one last little pesky problem.
Yeah.
I just read an article this morning saying, yeah, domestic violence is shooting way up during this pandemic. You think? Dr. John Campbell also postulated that we're at 9 months from now, we're going to see a lot of babies born. Well, maybe not as many babies as 100 years ago after everyone was sheltering at home, but still more.
Does this situation work?
Yes. Now, I will speak to it because, as you said, it is central. And
am I wrong about that?
It
is central.
And I think Eric put his finger on it, and that's I think this last half hour of the whole conversation is really outstanding.
Of course.
Okay.
But my speaking to it is probably going to change the comment section of this video, but so be it.
You know what? If they don't want to come along for the ride, I think that the most important thing is to just try to do this. I don't mean to say this to be horrible, but let's try to take some of the stupid fun out of discussing sexuality by talking about it for what it is, and a central system that has to be discussed because it is the engine of human behavior.
That is such an interesting comment. Is you mean that in a Freudian way? You mean that in an evolutionary way? And because well, if you mean it in a reductionistic way, sex is a big deal. Sex is a really big deal. We all got here because of it.
So your brother and I had this conversation when we met, and obviously with his background in evolutionary biology and primate mating and whatever, I was very interested in his perspective. And
But by the way, and I've been reading a lot of Chesterton lately, so you'll have to forgive me, but perpetually looking to apes to gain insight into human sexuality is itself a remarkable move. I just had to say that.
Took a little while, but for what it's worth.
And let me just jump in 1 second. Brett, were he here, would break the theory of selection into two pieces. There would be the stuff that follows natural selection the way we expect it from Darwin, and then he would break it into a second piece, which is the stuff that goes completely counterintuitive due to sexual selection.
Right.
And that division is actually part of the standard evolutionary toolkit. He does it a little bit better and a little bit differently.
Right.
But that division into natural and sexual selection is part of the territory.
And it really matters for when we think about resource scarcity, because the resources that people need to deal with the first part, the survival part, are not that much.
Right.
Actually. But the resources that people need to deal with the mating part is more than the other guy, historically. Which is why the guy with the 150-foot yacht might feel bad when the 200-foot yacht pulls up.
Okay, before we get to that, and this is the part that's coming is really the part that I really caught my attention. But if you go back to my patriarch same-sex marriage video that I did last week. A lot of these things get very interesting. I mean, I think Peterson was right to note that in human sexuality, the storyverse and the, let's say, the animal nature, in a sense, really come together in a high way. And this is where they're going to go, because high status men have more access, better access, high status women, on and on and on and on. But again, if you remember the world of the patriarchs, you just have to read the book of Samuel, and you very quickly get a sense of human beings, why women who produce sons were heroes of their tribe. I mean, this is life and death stuff. And barren women, I love at the beginning of 1 Samuel where Hannah is barren, and there's Hannah and Peninnah. Bible knowledge test. Elkanah has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah has had sons and Hannah has none, and her husband goes to her, says, "Isn't my love for you more than, greater than 7 sons?" And she's like, "Hell no!" Status is about sons, and that's why when you get to Jacob and Leah and Rachel, you have this whole derby about sons, because amongst the tribe, the woman that could produce many sons, she had status. And the woman who was barren has no status. And if you don't understand this status thing, you can't understand, many of the most interesting narratives within the Old Testament, because it's all about sons, and the sons are connected to flourishing and outcompeting your rival wife or your rival tribe or your rival village or your rival nation. And the reason Egypt is a perpetual empire and a perpetual power is because they produce all of this food, and all of that food goes to all of that population, and on and on and on and on, and everybody lives in fear of them. So it's a really big deal. And we cooperate in order to compete. That's Brett's saying, and there's a lot of truth to that saying. This is it's the engine of human history. And then now we're going to get into this question of status and mating and sex, and the guy who has the 200-foot yacht, the guy who has the 300-foot yacht, and all these billionaires who want to be president. Well, yeah, this is a big deal.
And let's say this is close. You're not an evolutionary theorist, and I'm not, but we can do our best. There is a version of evolutionary theory which states that there needs to be crisis. There needs to be a function for showing that you are better in order to keep individuals. And
now we got one. We see all these governors on TV, and who's doing the best as governor? Is it Cuomo in New York, or is it Newsom here in California? And what about that Michigan governor? And with Biden, Biden was looking at her, and Biden already sort of limited half of the potential, limited his scope of potential VP candidates because it's got to be a woman now. He went and mentioned that, and well, you're looking around during the pandemic, and you might have found one that the governor that's impressing the nation. You might not be able to pick a rock star because you backed yourself into a corner, but anyway.
Max, sort of on that razor's edge of performance, and that mating opportunities means that there's always a crisis. There's never enough abundance, because somebody with 13 homes is more desirable than somebody with 9 homes if you're just trying to figure out if there were a crisis,
right,
who would do better.
Right. So we have to overcome that, because that drives a Malthusian situation of no amount of resource ever brings sufficiency about.
Right.
And drives a fundamental rivalry, which is why you said we have to address it. So my take on this as I explored it, my process with myself has been asking, okay, as soon as I saw that the dynamics of this world that seemed intuitive and natural to most of us as we kind of grew up in it and were conditioned by it,
right,
were self-terminating, then I said, any of the things that we think of as normal, I'm willing to question deeply.
Okay.
And so could I imagine a high-tech civilization that doesn't implode? Could I imagine a kind of enlightened planet? What would life be like there? All the different things.
An enlightened planet. Now again, at some point you have to ask, okay, we're using all these other words to sound rather medical or antiseptic or an enlightened planet where what does that look like? I mean, you can throw the word out there, but can you draw me a picture? Well, maybe it looks like something I saw in a Star Trek movie or a Star Wars movie, or it's where people aren't. It doesn't look like a lot of what we have seen families look like and villages look like. Maybe that there are moments, and I love how John McWhorter talks about this, and in many ways this conversation and sort of the woke conversation come together, because John McWhorter talks about this in that people have these coaches to get them to get rid of all of their, white people have these coaches to get rid of all of their racism. And John McWhorter's kind of like, okay, well, what does that look like? Really, what does that look like? And you say, well, it's us without racism. Okay. And because racism is pervasive. Okay. And now again, I'm a Calvinist, so I agree racism is pervasive. And I agree with a lot of the charges. I'm just skeptical because what you're having a really hard time pointing to is the straight stick rather than the crooked stick. Is what life without all of this aggression would look like. Now, maybe and very quickly religious imagery comes in. And I'm amazed how often I see, is it Buddhist imagery? Is it Eastern imagery? I don't know how to describe it, but when you go into a hospital marketing materials are using like people, levitating in a lotus position, or they're doing yoga. Just pay attention how much imagery this is. And this gets into the question of, can we actually picture the good and the ideal? And it's really hard. I remember Peter Kreeft talking about C.S. Lewis's Aslan character, because it's really compelling drama to do Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad and The Sopranos. It's very difficult, apart from these glimpses, to really show the ideal. And so we'll throw out these words, and I'm not casting shade on other religions in this, and because in fact there are portions of the Bible that get brought out. The lion lays down with the lamb, and neither shall they harm on all my holy mountain. And there are these halcyon days in the book of Acts when everybody shared what they had, and so these guys are barking up a very religious tree. And in fact, for the most part, most of the stock images that we have are religious, because if you just show, I don't know, some rapper on a 300-foot boat with, again, I mean, it's amazing how often sex comes into this. And if you look at someone challenged in the comment section, it might have been Carl, talked about Islam. And 40 virgins. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting, in my Calvinist days, in my days growing up in Christian school, nobody ever said, well, if you do the right thing, then when you die, you'll get limitless sex with. And what's the deal about virgins in heaven anyway? So it just gets interesting. But again, part of the reason so much contemporary marketing iconography looks religious says a lot about the dilemma that these two are really facing in this conversation. And so to use a word like enlightenment, and it's not so much enlightenment as in, I don't know, 17th and 18th century guys from Christendom who are playing around with science. It's not, our image is less John Locke and more Buddha, isn't it, when we use that word in this way?
Conflict, emotion, resources, and sexuality is obviously one of the big. And so, dynamics of this world. So we have to overcome that, because that drives a Malthusian situation of no amount of resource ever brings sufficiency about.
Right.
And drives a fundamental rivalry, which is why you said we have to address it. So my take on this as I explored it.
Now I could be a little dismissive, but I do want to say here that to do these conversations, to record them like this and share them, this is all high wire stuff. And both these guys are super smart, way smarter than I am, and better read than I am, and so on and so forth. So, I'm not really taking anything away from them, but I'm just pointing out what I observe as they do it. And, by no means, and I have, if I would use it, the luxury of actually editing my words here. This is really hard stuff.
My process and drives a fundamental rivalry, which is why you said we have to address it. So my take on this as I explored it, my process with myself has been asking, okay, as soon as I saw that the dynamics of this world that seemed intuitive and natural to most of us as we kind of grew up in it and were conditioned by it, right, were self-terminating, then I said,
so the dynamics of this world are self-terminating. All of the, it's so funny because we also have this other major marketing trend. If we want everything to be natural, and it's like, oh yeah, but that's the natural world that's self-terminating, right? And again, this is another Jordan Peterson point that he makes.
Of the things that we think of as normal, I'm willing to question deeply.
Okay.
And so could I imagine a high-tech civilization that doesn't implode? Could I imagine a kind of enlightened planet? What would life be like there? All the different things, conflict, emotion, resources, and sexuality is obviously one of the big questions.
Now, it's very interesting that the imagining he's trying to do is active. And this is very different from if we look at, and I've already said that, it's almost all religious imagery and iconography, and I use that word intentionally here, that we use or emulate or mimic if we're trying to collectively imagine this or image it together. I would assert that most of that stuff had its origin in, well, first of all, deeply religious contexts, but also far less intentionalized, rationalized context than what we're playing in right here.
And I think,
in other words, the dude goes up to a mountain and he comes down and here it is. I had it when I was, this is why everybody's crazy about getting on psychedelics, because you get there quicker instead of, being a monk in the desert.
I think the book Sex at Dawn obviously gets plenty of things wrong. It's trying to make a strong antithesis.
I'm not sure what book that is. Maybe I should look it up. Sex Anon? Is that what? I tried Googling it, and I got a huge page for 12-step programs for sex addicts. So, so if you know what book he's talking about, leave it in the comments because I'm curious.
Thesis to the standard evolutionary history of Homo sapiens thesis, but I think there are some key parts to it. When they look at the Maswa people or the Canela people or people that did not have...
And this is always another interesting thing to me, that we so we got chimps and apes, and we got all of this hierarchical, status-driven ape sexuality going, and it's like, oh, but the bonobos. And then we look at the 99% of human behavior, and we beat the bushes, and we find this tiny little tribe over here where they're doing sex differently, and oh, look at them. It's like, and they're actually going to address this here, because there's an objection in there that says, yeah, but, and you could point that objection to saints and the church. You've got all of these run-of-the-mill Christians who are just as miserable and misery causing as anyone else. Oh, look at the saint, look at Jesus, look at, so fair enough.
That had a stable society that was not primarily pair bonded, but had
a tiny little stable society that wasn't predominantly pair bonded, but
multi-male, multi-female dynamics. It's not to say that's how humans mostly were. That doesn't matter. It's to say that it's a possibility. If it's within the possibility set, same with Buddhism.
Yeah, the possibility sense. When you're treading in that realm, there's a lot of possibilities. So the question then is, what is the imagined straight stick that we can't really describe that is pointing you to that group of people? What aspects of their community do you say they get this right and we get and they got that wrong? Now again, this sort of, now we're talking selection bias, because if we say, well, Bill Gates is the way a human being should live their life. Oh, okay. Or Eric Weinstein is the way a human being should live their life, or Jordan Peterson is the way a human being should live their life, or Paul Vanderklay is the way a human being should live their life. Okay, but here's where you get the Vervaekian relevance realization, because it's, okay, what thing out of the near infinite number of things are you pointing to and then drawing your correlation? It's really hard. Combinatorial explosion.
I'm not saying that's how people mostly have been.
It doesn't have to win. It just needs to establish proof of concept, and then we can try to scale it up from there.
Yeah, it's a positive deviant analysis for proof of concept to then say, can we make that is that a viable model for a new center?
Now, again, what about that model do you say, that model's a lot better than this model? Now, maybe it's because this model is the one that you grew up in, and you realized, Dad and Mom fought all the time, and Dad would step out, and Mom would keep her mouth shut, or on and on and on and on and on. That model over there, where they had more sex, better sex, hotter sex. What about that model? What is the thing that is going to, the context of the conversation, anti-rivalry. Nobody gets upset about. And, Brave New World. I mean, that's exactly what Brave New World was. Again, you weren't allowed to say no. And then we'll talk about the Oneida community. Same thing. No sticky love. But that way, no more rivalry about sex partners. Oh, okay. Gosh. Because when I think about this, I laugh, because just look at OkCupid's data. There's this great little video out there that I've played in past videos, and you can find it pretty easily. I think it was on The Atlantic or New York Times or something like this. And basically it was, women tended to want men that were kind of about their age, but the men were all like all the 20-year-olds. Why? There's a picture. Men are dumb. And so, it's very evolutionary. It's very evolutionary that the men will line up for the 20-year-olds. And I'm not sure how anti-rivalrous this is going to be. But anyway, go on.
And is that a possible thing to make? And the fact that it didn't make it through evolution so far, like evolution has a blind quality to it, right? Where it'll make an adaptation that makes sense in the moment, determined by something.
There are so many bawdy jokes one could make at this moment.
Like warfare, that is actually not good long-term, or is even self-terminating long-term. So the argument, if it would have been a good system, it would have made it. Well, the thing that has made it is continuing to up-ratchet rivalrous capacity.
Like
and that itself is going to self-terminate.
Like meta-class hacking, that somehow we've hacked ourselves into a position that we can keep surviving.
Yeah.
And so one version says that we can never escape the evolutionary imperatives. The other says we have always escaped whatever our last problem was, and so we should expect that even if there's only this sliver of hope, we should exploit it to the fullest.
And I love these two guys because, I mean, they're able to, you can see the problem, but they're able to put such good words on it and say, well, there it is. And that's why it's a good conversation. It's back and forth, back and forth. The conversation is good because it's rivalrous, but it's not rivalrous in this stupid way where it's just about ego and status. It's productive, but it's still rivalrous. And that's just it. That it's not abandoning all rivalry, because actually, and Eric talks about this all the time, and it's sort of the subtle, the subtle, most universal, obvious thing about us is that, well, I'm not interested in that. And so it's all interest that drives this stuff. And the reason that this conversation is interesting is because there's enough rivalry in it. It's sort of like C.S. Lewis's second friend. Is the first friend is the person that you agree with the person on everything, and you're just enjoying the community of agreement. The second friend is the person that you disagree with on just about everything, but they're rivalrous enough, but they're also not too they're rivalrous enough in all the right ways and not so in all the wrong ways to actually make it interesting.
Yeah, and so generally this situation happens that we have a near-term incentive to pursue some advantage, but where the disadvantage of that thing might happen over a much longer term. And that's like one of the fundamental problems, right? The externality might show up over hundreds or thousands of years, but the benefit...
And they talk about these externalities in this video. And again, this is all really good stuff. And I really grow and I learn from this stuff, because it's the problem of the commons where, if I don't have to pay for, I've got this great chemical process that makes the best Drano that you could imagine, but a byproduct of making this new super Drano is this really caustic chemical. And if I actually have to process this chemical, it's going to make my new super Drano prohibitively expensive compared to all the less costly Dranos, and so I'm going to dump it into the Passaic River. And if you know the Passaic River, you can see a lot of commons externalities have been dumped into the Passaic River, and it's really a shame, because it's a beautiful little river that don't ever eat any fish that comes out of that river. And there at the bottom of the falls, there's all this foam, and it's like, and we'd visit the falls as children, and all the spray would come up on us, and everything in the winter would be all frozen, and it'd be like this. But then when you'd get back in the car after visiting the falls, it'd be like, what's that smell? It's all the water. It's because all the problem of the commons, everybody's dumping into it. And so, well, this is a problem that we have.
Occurs over this year, so we have to do it. So we have to get over that, actually. If we're affecting the world in such fundamental ways over the long term, we have to actually be factoring that into our decision making now. That's one of the minimum requirements of a game B if it's going to exist, which also means of a viable civilization at all. So
now again, it's interesting because, well, what's our goal here? Well, we want to save the world from us, for us, and we want it to be everlasting. And again, when I listen to this, it's like, where have I heard this before? Oh yeah, I heard it from me. I heard it from preaching. I heard it from the Bible. It's eschatology. It's what the church has been talking about, and all of this. Well, we want just enough rivalry so that people actually do something, but we don't want too much rivalry. And the job of a pastor, I gotta be careful what I say now, because now I've got real people in mind. The job of a pastor is to help people get along and to be better, more mature people. That's my whole job. And it's playing around with these really cool ideas. But what's so funny is, like, I listen to these guys talk, and it's like, yeah, I know everything that you're talking about because I've been in church my whole life. And you've got all these fancy words. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Eric Weinstein, and one of my constant complaints about Jordan Peterson, was that Jordan Peterson, was all about the individual. Great. It was all about the individual. And part of the reason I started making videos was because as a pastor, I know that if people are going to grow, they're going to need oh, I listened to a Jordan Peterson video and I'm all psyched up about meaning and I'm ready to do my future authoring program. I'm going to do this stuff. I'm going to clean my room and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and you need an institution around you to help you keep doing it, to help scale this amongst other people, to deal with, well, I'm only going to have an institution. I'm only going to have conversations with people who are mature and brilliant and insightful and articulate. Oh, the people at the top of the hierarchy. What about the rest of the schmucks? What about the rest of the people who aren't that bright and aren't that mature and aren't that good? And gosh, you get them all in church, and it's like, it's not a church I'd ever want to go to because look at all the people. But that's the point of the institution. And Weinstein talks about institutions. His conversation with, I just have to scroll down a little bit, with James O'Keefe, a very interesting conversation. And Weinstein's complaint was you should focus more on institutions, not on individuals. And so Weinstein gets institutions, and I really love that about him. But listening to these two talk, it's like, yeah, you're talking about what has been happening in church for like 2,000 years. And your goals are about the same. Isn't that what's happening here?
When it comes to status, because I think status and sexuality go largely together. It's not exactly one for one, but...
And if you think churches don't run into sex problems, those are the only kinds of things that get in the news.
There's a strong correlation. I was listening to you on a few podcasts, and you were talking about E prime and talking about spinors and your kind of geometric unity. And I was just fucking loving it. And I was loving even the status of like you describing theoretical physics and mathematics well, which are topics that you know so much better than I do, but that I'm fascinated by, and educating the public about it. And there was no like status competition impulse in me that was like, oh, but wait, he is being seen as smart for these things. I was like, wow, this is fucking awesome. I hope that he gets more status doing that because it's obvious.
In other words, he had a moment when it's the, as C.S. Lewis call it, the specific, how did C.S. Lewis phrase it? The specific pleasure of the inferior. When I recognize that, if you're on a team with a whole bunch of other kids and maybe you're playing basketball and you've got one player who is head and shoulders your best player, everybody else on the team, they all want time on the floor. They all want to play. But what they really want is to win. Again, now you're using rivalrous things. And so I want this person that can obviously do this better than me. I want him or her in the game so that our team can win. In other words, we cooperate in order to compete.
It's good for the world.
Jeez. I have such different intuitions about this. I mean, to be blunt about it, I didn't really talk about this stuff for ages. And there was a part of me that cared about status. But this was always a part. In fact, I really, to the extent that I think that I have anything interesting and new, it is a very uncomfortable feeling. I mean, I could show you all sorts of cool things on, if I came up with a new lick on the guitar, I would enjoy showing it to you. Mm-hmm. This is something I have felt very uncomfortable about. And there are ways in which, it's very apart for me from the status game. I've been fascinated looking at some of the comments where people say, so-and-so's in it for the grift and they just want money and this is an ego trip. And I have to say the least fun part, the reason I didn't do a podcast for a long time and the reason that I didn't commercialize this and I left a lot of money on the table and I'm intending to commercialize this, is that I was very uncomfortable with all of these issues. I didn't like it. And I think people imagine that their first few increments of status are fun so that getting more and more status must be awesome. And I actually don't think that that's true. I think it's a little bit like, wow, my first taste of heroin was pretty sweet. I should do this all the time. It goes into some completely different place.
And this is the part of the conversation that I thought was really outstanding. And I can't read the family message chat and put my watch away. But this is the part of the conversation that was really good, because here we're recognizing, well, yeah, status is, and I'm guilty of this time. I mean, status is a really big deal. Status is an enormous deal. And, it was a number of years ago that I began to recognize just how much of the New Testament deals in status, and how, and again, Peugeot puts all of this in really interesting terms, how Jesus comes and deals with this status stuff all the time. Read Philippians 2. And read when he tells his disciples, the greatest among you is the servant of all, and he pulls a kid who's probably standing in the corner and waiting on tables of the disciples and says, this is the greatest among you, and the greatest among you is the servant of all. I mean, Jesus is constantly dealing with that status stuff, but status here is, and I love this idea that they come together, which is that just this, in small dosages, it's like, I should, if my life could be all this, think about Edmund and Turkish Delight and C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Well, Turkish Delight 24/7 would soon become misery. And I think these two language this really well here.
Yeah, so that is counter to the narrative that we're all seeking maximum status and in competition with each other for status.
Well, I think that that is a low resolution narrative.
Right.
And I think that, it's like, I always make fun of the fact that evolutionarily you're crazy for sugar, and the fact that they give it away for free at Starbucks, there's some part of you that's a three-year-old kid just wants to eat as many packets of sugar as you possibly can. It's not going to be a good thing.
Right.
Yeah. Keep going.
And I think about that. I played it once in one of my videos, and YouTube ripped that video down so fast. Louis C.K. talked about, we fly through the air in these airplanes, and, they're giving away sugar at, if someone were to step out of the ancient world and look at our lives, they would say, what do you mean the kingdom of God? You're living it here and now. They're giving away sugar at Starbucks, for Pete's sake.
Sorry about that.
Well, so this is the thing. I think it's actually true that there's a lot of status that is not really that fun. This is also my experience. But I think it's also true that we can feel good about rather than bad about where someone else is doing socially well.
Well, if we have a kind of love and trust, and we have an idea, like, I'm friends with Andrew Yang. I disagree with a bunch of his policies, but I have a feeling that he is a guy who's just earnest.
Yeah.
Knowing him socially, I have the sense that it is not an ego trip for him to want to steward the country. It's you're taking on a position that puts you in a life and death situation with the number of attempts on presidents' lives, let's say. It
is an ego trip too.
Very solemn responsibility. And I think that in part, we want people who we feel are grounded. And by the way, I'm not always grounded, so I've drunk my own status, to excess at times, but it's a very tricky thing. Who do I want to have status? Who do I not want to have status? Do I trust? I have a friend who is the nicest person in the world, except when he's doing well, and then he becomes very difficult to deal with. So that there's the person who's fine on one glass of alcohol, and you don't want them to have three.
Yeah. So I think status as a hypernormal stimuli, where in an evolutionary environment, we couldn't necessarily have more than 150 people pay attention to us.
Yeah.
And now we can have a huge number of people pay attention to us.
And these kind of arguments are always fascinating. It's and they're in, so again, basically, this is Dunbar number or something that they'll talk about, that here we can, Basically, we're built. I love the language. We're built to inhabit a community of such and such a size, and when the community, what we've done now is scaled up way beyond what we've normally been able to build by, and so we have these little hacks to get up to these, and now via social media, now a few thousand people can listen to me, and that just sort of jacks everything up. And it was Jonathan Peugeot who had mentioned, on YouTube we're beings of light, and we're probably monkeying around with deep things in our head that have been programmed in other ways. And so we have these little internet YouTube celebrities, and on and on and on, and this says status and so on and so forth. It's helpful to remember, though, that the whole project of this conversation is another hack. And they've talked about this, what are going to be the downsides of the hack? And we're not going to probably know the downsides of the hack for hundreds of years later, because I was just reading an article from the Smithsonian Mag was talking about the impact of past pandemics, and how, one of the things that pandemics forced cities to do was, well, let's no longer have horses defecating in the street, and let's not let garbage pile up, and let's not have people empty chambered pots out the window. Let's have sanitation. So then you had sewers, and all those sewers just led to the lake or to the river, and then we shouldn't have that anymore. So now we have a sewage treatment plant. I mean, it says boom, 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 boom. Well, we don't know. Okay, so we got rid of horses, and we have internal combustion engines, and now we face the fact that, well, internal combustion engines are maybe adding to more greenhouse gases than horses would. I don't know. Some smart person out there would do the math, and I've just triggered the CO2 climate thing. So you can cut and paste your comments now, but there we are.
And have it metricized with likes or whatever. I think it is, like sugar, a hypernormal stimulus that is very hard for it not to be bad for us, and we actually have to have a very mature relationship to it.
And again, back to, we have to have a mature relationship. Now we're using this other word, and it's the right word, so that a mature relationship with sugar is, I can have a little bit of sugar in my coffee, but not too much sugar. What do you mean by mature? Well, actually, what we're talking about is a limit on your desires, in order to say no to myself about sugar, in order to say no to drinking my own Kool-Aid about status, in order to say no to thinking that I am more than I am not. Again, we're just barking up very religious trees here.
And addiction of any kind, any hypernormal stimulus that decreases normal.
And again, it's number 13 in John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where he both has that, really, I thought, extremely helpful conversation about Buddhism, and then talking about addiction. And addiction is reciprocal narrowing, where now your whole life is about chasing sugar. And so you as a human being were made to be greater than your desire for sugar, but sugar diminishes you. And if there can be reciprocal narrowing, can there also be reciprocal broadening or widening, to use Vervaeke's language? And so now we're getting into this, and we're going to get more into addiction stuff here.
Stimulus is going to end up being net bad for us. I think one of the metrics for how healthy a society is inverse relationship to addictive.
Now notice we're looking for a metric for healthy. Well, why would we need that? Because it's really hard. And in fact, 15, 20 years ago, again, all this stuff I've dealt with it in church stuff. A friend of mine became the top executive for the denomination, and the main program he was rolling out, we're not going to talk about church growth, because, well, cancerous, that's growth without limits. We're going to talk about church health, and health talks more about balance. But then the question is, what does healthy look like? Well, my sons who are in their 20s are certainly healthier than I am. And we can look at that in terms of numbers, blood pressure, cholesterol. We can look at all of those things. But, what is the right blood pressure. Well, there's a range, and there's, what is the right weight and what is the right health. I mean, that's, again, we're sort of inching towards the eschaton here, but always with inches.
Dynamics.
Fascinating.
Healthy environment conditions people that are not prone.
Because healthy would be about flourishing or thriving. And again, we're using more words to try to say what we don't have words for.
To addiction, which means have actual more authenticity of choice. Because
authenticity, another one of these words that we're going to use, which more authenticity of choice. And again, I like Vervaeke's words, agency. We're going to have more agency in the way that, again, all these words only have meaning in the cluster and constellation of the other words and in the images and the pictures that we have. And so authenticity has become that of course, that, well, where's my authenticity? Read Charles Taylor. I'm sure he has. These guys have read everyone.
Addiction, compulsion writ large is less authenticity of choice. And what's interesting is the hypernormal stimulus.
And again, there's sort of a stalking these conversations are the questions of this secret self, or this second self, or this other self, or this perfect self, or this true self, and again, it's just Christian language without paying any attention to this Christian stuff.
Porn is to sex what sugar and salt and fat concentrated in a Frappuccino or a McDonald's. Healthy for it not to be bad for us, and we actually have to have a very mature relationship to it. And addiction of any kind, any hypernormal stimulus that decreases normal stimulus, is going to end up being net bad for us. I think one of the metrics for how healthy a society is inverse relationship to addictive dynamics.
Fascinating.
Healthy environment conditions people that are not prone to addiction, which means have actual more authenticity of choice, because addiction, compulsion writ large is less authenticity of choice. And
less authenticity of choice. What does that mean? That some choices are authentic and other choices are inauthentic. Okay, you just used authentic instead of true. That's all we've done, but that's the fashionable word now.
What's interesting is the hypernormal stimulus, what porn is to sex, what sugar and salt and fat concentrated in a Frappuccino or a McDonald's is to food, right? Devoid of the actual nutrition or devoid of the actual intimacy.
So
concentrating.
Proximates that betray the ultimates. Originally, the proximate stimulus was tied to the ultimate, and that's right. The brain keeps track of the proximates, and then you can disconnect some of these, like birth control, disconnected sexuality from procreation.
Right. And in the same way, if there was a healthy status relationship of in a tribal...
And again, I don't want to run through this too fast, because they run through... That's the thing. It's a 3-hour plus conversation, but they run through a ton of stuff fast. And I love the... Okay, so again, now all of this stuff is a whole picture. And so the picture is that, well, you've got the proto-human out there on the Serengeti, and sweet stuff and fat stuff and salty stuff is rare. And so when we find it, we're abnormally motivated to seek the sweet and the salty and the fatty, because we need these things, and these things are relatively rare in the Serengeti. And now in the American suburban or urban world, these things are all over the place, but our brains are still wired for the Serengeti, and therefore we overeat. That's the contemporary picture. And okay, but I don't know. Is that the picture? So what then is the healthy diet? Is it Jordan Peterson's meat only? Is it the food pyramid? I mean, the alarming thing about it's 2020, for goodness sakes, is that we don't even know what to feed a human being. We don't know what a human being should eat. It's like we've never met one. And here we're wondering, well, what should a person eat? Well, all things, What did you learn from your mother? Everything in moderation. All right, so a little bit of sugar and a little bit of salt and a little bit of fat. Not too much, but not too little. And we don't even know. But we know we're having this conversation, and it's a good conversation, and we're talking about things. We're strange creatures.
Environment where I can't really lie and people really are disconnect the actual nutrition or devoid of the actual intimacy,
so
concentrating.
Proximates that betray the ultimates. Originally, the proximate stimulus was tied to the ultimate, and that's right. The brain keeps track of the proximates, and then you can disconnect some of these, like birth control.
So my brain keeps track of, I want this, but it doesn't keep track of my cholesterol levels. Even though another part of us in all of these conversations is always looking for the intuitive and the instinctive, because that's supposed to lead us where? Lead us to truth, lead us to the kingdom of God.
Disconnected sexuality from procreation.
Right. And in the same way, if there was a healthy status relationship of in a tribal environment where I can't really lie and people really are watching me and know me, if I'm thought well of, it's because I'm actually doing well by everybody and I have authentic, healthy relationships.
And it's so funny because did you ever grow up in a small town or in a small community? I went from K through 12 in the most populous urban area in America with pretty much the same kids, because we were all in this little Christian school. So about 88 of us or so went from K through 12 together. So a lot of those dynamics he's pointing to are true. But there are also some other, are they externalities, where it's also the case, look at family dynamics. You can't outlive that one event you made. I'm thinking a lot about identity with some other series of videos that I'm doing. And, here's the thing. Identity is shaped by, what is identity shaped by? When we're talking about same-sex behavior, identity is shaped by sexual desire. Identity is shaped by things you did once. If you're living in that small town, or you're living in that family, or you're going to school with the same kids all the way through, you did things once, and you will forever be known as the person that did that. And the entire community reinforces that and rehearses that and never lets you out of being that person. It's what it means to be in a family in many ways. You play these roles, and for the sake of the group, you inhabit these roles, and. So there's a lot going on here.
As opposed to, I can signal things that aren't true. And even get more status through negative signaling about other people and things like that, and get a lot of hits from it. That is the same kind of thing as the fast food or the porn is. And so I think we have a hyponormal environment of the healthy stimulus that actually creates a baseline well-being. So most people, I find that when they go camping with their friends and they're in nature and they're actually in real, authentic human relationships, they're checking their phone for...
It's so funny when they go camping with their friends, as if... I was just having a conversation with my wife this morning about how the fact that I raided the church's homeless supplies. Well, how dare I do that during this time? Well, why? What was in the churches? People, because they know I'm always dealing with homeless people, and so they... Here, Pastor, these are the things you're going to need to help with the homeless. One of the things they always give me are, again, I'm sitting right here on my table, antibacterial wipes and hand sanitizer. Rare commodities these days. I brought them into my office. You know why? Homeless people don't care about this. If I step outside my office right now, it smells like a toilet. You want to know why? Because it's been raining. And it smells like a toilet because it's being used as a toilet. And that's not very nice, and that's not very hygienic. And they're living in a toilet. You think they're worried about sanitizing their hands? Well, when I go camping, camping is a very interesting thing that sort of started in the 60s and 70s. And sure, John Muir did it before, but Going camping was a very different thing than a mountain man going out west. Or, in other words, again, relevance realization. What exactly is it? And so then he tells this story about basically going on vacation with his friends, and they're all on their best behavior. That's as opposed to being stuck in your house with the same people all the time while you're in quarantine.
Actually creates baseline well-being. So most people, I find that when they go camping with their friends and their environment.
Most people, when they go camping with their friends, in other words, most people go camping and have friends.
Of the healthy stimulus that actually creates baseline well-being. So most people, I find that when they go camping with their friends and they're in nature and they're actually in real, authentic human relationships, they're checking their phone for dopamine hits from email or Facebook less. And they're also opening the fridge, just blindly looking less often.
Because you didn't take your fridge camping.
Because they're actually having an authentic, meaningful, engaging interaction.
And he's making a really important point here, though, that even though we can't really define it, and we really struggle to define it, and we define it very poorly, when human community is healthy, we're less prone to these addictions. And again, this has been made in a number of different times, in a number of different places, that if in fact the mice are doing well, they don't become addicted. But dysfunction tends to reciprocal narrowing, as Vervaeke notes.
But in a world where I have a lot of isolation, nuclear family, home structures, etc.
Oh, that's interesting.
And not connected to nature and not necessarily connected to meaningfulness that much, that hyponormal environment creates increased susceptibility to hypernormal stimuli.
And this goes back to, I can't think about that book again. I can't think about the title. But this goes back to the question of, oh, well then why don't you live on the Serengeti, where the sugars and the salts and the fats are rare? Why don't you run naked through those environments? I mean, why don't you choose that? Why don't you live with your cluster of 150 people camping permanently? Why don't you get rid of your cell phone? Again, and all the points he's making are really, really good, and that's why I really like this. But there's something funny going on here.
Hypernormal stimuli happen to be good for markets. Because on the supply side, if I want to maximize lifetime value of a customer, addiction is good for lifetime value of a customer.
And maybe I'm addicted to the things that being a business success brings me.
But it is very bad for society as a whole.
And that's such an interesting conversation. That's bam. That's a value judgment just right there. Is that true? I don't know. You're just stating it.
This I really like. So if I understand you correctly, people don't. I mean, this actually starts to solve a puzzle. I think I heard that somebody asked Matt Damon whether he enjoyed being famous, and he said it was, if I have the story right, and maybe somebody else, forgive me if I'm wrong, he said it wasn't even fun for 15 minutes.
Which is, I think, true. And I think it's insightful. But then someone might ask, well, then why did you start getting into acting and writing and Hollywood when that was the inevitable thing? You know, if you went into plumbing instead, you could have avoided it.
And this is the hardest thing to convey, is that if you've never had any kind of status at all,
right?
That, you know, I think I said to Tim Ferriss that you only wanted to be famous to 3,000 hand-chosen people. You want your calls returned, you know?
And again, I think that's tremendously insightful. And yeah, well, why do we want status? We want status because it helps us get what we want. Well, we just had a conversation about the fact that getting what we want is a problem.
you want to be taken seriously when you have something to say. You do not want to be universally known. And that was the hardest decision in starting this podcast. Was I didn't think I had another option. I mean, part of the point of it is to get out ideas that I worry are not institutional. There's no institution that's embracing these ideas.
So he thinks institutionally. I think that's good and that's right.
And I couldn't figure out, I mean, I tried for months. Is there a way to do this without becoming part of the story?
Right.
And because I think that privacy and an individual life is so much more important.
And that's so interesting. Oh, there's just so much interesting stuff about this end of this conversation. Could I do this without becoming part of the story? But what you want, and rightly so, is to change the story for everyone. And part of the reason you want it changed for everyone is you want to have it changed for yourself and changed for your children and changed for your progeny. And you're willing to take some sacrifices. And again, this is just all starting to sound very Christian.
I don't believe that every time you bring something up, it means that you should have your life ripped open and be dissected and discussed. It's very unnatural. I think what you're trying to...
Maybe is that what I'm doing? It's just a few thousand of my closest friends are going to listen to this video. Less than 3,000. It'll be okay.
Tell me is that people think that they want to be fabulously rich. They think they want to be famous. They think they want unlimited sexual access. And in fact, it is the first few tastes of these things that convince them that there must be no limit to how wonderful the world can be if only that can be mine. And in fact, there is something. I mean, it's sort of, like Rosebud at the end of Citizen Kane.
Yeah, those are much more like addiction than fulfillment. And addiction will give me a spike and then a crash. And then because of the crash, I'm more craving something that will spike me because I feel really shitty. But then I get an erosion of baseline over time from the effects of that. And so, of course, the chocolate cake is going to make me feel good in the moment. But as I have a mostly chocolate cake diet, my life feels shittier as I average, right? As I do the integral under the curve, it gets worse. Whereas the salad doesn't really give me that spike. But as I get healthier, my baseline of pleasure throughout, not just when I'm eating, but all of the time, goes up because I have the capacity to engage in more interesting, meaningful things and my body doesn't hurt as much and whatever. So I think the interesting thing is that it is actually just like a healthier relationship to, or a more effective relationship to pleasure is anti-addictive. But I think most of these things that people think they want are hypernormal stimuli. That is the dopaminergic part separated from the substance.
What is the substance?
I don't know how much I believe this, but I like it a lot. So if I understand you correctly, there is a world of pleasure. I don't even want to call it pleasure. I don't even know what to call it.
We don't know what to call it. That's exactly the point. And again, there is a world of pleasure. I think I'm listening to all kinds of 19th century, not very well written Christian hymns.
Maybe it's much more on fulfillment. That we would give up that. No, let me say it differently. What you're really saying is we are blind to the effect that somatic pleasure and status pleasure is crowding out fulfillment in our lives. And that were we to actually understand the cost of pleasure, of rivalry, that there's an individual reason to abandon somatic pleasure as the be all and end all of how we grade a life. I mean, this is how many awesome trips to Vegas did I have? Is that the thing that's going to matter most to me on my deathbed?
Yeah, I don't think it ever has.
Read The Road to Character, David Brooks, eulogy virtues versus resume virtues. Not this entire conversation, but the difference they're talking about right there. There's a world of pleasure. No, not pleasure. There's a world of fulfillment. There's a world of, and how can we get to that world? Well, we need to rein in on our desires And it's like, my gosh, have you read the book of Romans?
And I don't think it's ever what people would be most hopeful that they're...
Let's give it a name, because I don't think I've ever been down this particular route. Let's call it deathbed mindset for the moment, just to play with it, see if it...
David Brooks called it eulogy virtues versus resume virtues.
works. And if it doesn't work, we'll trash it. So people on their death...
And he got it from a Jewish rabbi.
...bed become focused on, did I do enough for my community? Do my children think well of me?
Well, I think what happens is people realize that everything they got dies with them.
Can't take it with you.
Like all
in the end,
having mode versus being mode.
It's lineage only.
And the way I touch the world continues. And it's not just my biologic kid.
No, it's also...
And in fact, Eric and Brett's whole project is this. What can I leave the world? What will I leave the world behind me? Getting back to my conversation with a couple days ago when we talked about Nassim Taleb, religion as risk management. It's back to the patriarchs and not being cut off, and how do you perpetuate yourself into the future? I mean, again, how can we have a future with us when we're assassin robots and suicidal?
The lineage of my thoughts, like memes along with genes.
And so...
Legacy.
I think when we really start to think about this clearly, we recognize that this direction is self-terminating. The need to get stuff from the world. That when I die, it ends with me. That there is actually only a kind of self-transcendence and permanence in the way that I touch the world, which does ripple ongoingly. But there's also this thing where, again, I feel almost a little bit shy talking about it, even more than the sex topic in some ways, because I'm proposing that there is something like spiritual growth.
I think it's
that is actually necessary for civilization to make it.
Let's hear that again.
And so, about it, even permanence in the way that I touch the world, which does ripple ongoingly. But there's also this thing where, again, I feel almost a little bit shy talking about it, even more than the sex topic in some ways, because I'm proposing that there is something like spiritual growth.
I think it's
that is actually necessary for civilization to make it. And so people affirming that they are these to themselves, needy things that need stuff from the world.
I'd recommend that we actually affirm that to each other, because if we just admit it to ourselves quietly, it's actually a lot more powerful to hold each other accountable to this. Where would I learn all this stuff?
That need other people's validation and attention and etc. And living life that way, where the more of it they get, what they're still getting is the affirmation of that sense of self, as opposed to coming from a place of wholeness and the desire.
Where would we know that wholeness from?
And actual love for the beauty of life, and the desire to have their life be meaningful to life. That my life ends, but life with a capital L doesn't end. And that life starts to be central to my awareness more than my life is. And my life becomes meaningful, and it's...
That I am not my own. That in effect, I am poured out for you, the Apostle Paul says.
Coupling to life. This answers the sex question. It answers all the other questions, but...
And it answers the sex question because what is the sex question about? What is the only kind of sex we want? If we go to the other person and say, lay down there, I want to have a good time on you. No. I give myself for you. What is that? Well, that's love. Well, love is sacramentalized in sex. Oh, and that sacrament fans out in your life. And so, I want your sex, but I don't want any other entanglements. Oh. And we feel good about that, and we want that. And, it's G.K. Chesterton starts out one of his books where he says, the person goes out in a boat and they come back only to, thinking that they've arrived on the other side of the world, only to discover that they've back on English soil. I mean, this is what this conversation is like.
I don't think
there is a there to break through to.
Yeah.
And the problem that we're having conceiving of it in your mind. Now, again, I don't think this gets us out of all the issues that I've raised.
No, because we don't know how to get out of all the issues that you've raised.
But I think it's the first point at which I start to see that there's something really different about your perspective. So just...
Really different from what? It's the oldest perspective in the world.
As a slow learner.
If we take the kind of Girardian idea of all desire is mimetic.
Yeah.
Let's mention René Girard, but completely forget the main point of all of his teaching, okay?
And I'm oversimplifying it, but just meaning I want what other people have. And then that inexorably causes conflict, and then the conflict will inexorably cause violence. I think there is statistical truth to all three of those steps, but not inexorable truth to any of them. I don't only want things that other people have. Or that I learn from other people. There are things that are just intrinsically fascinating to me, or there
back to the interest thing.
Are wanting for other people that is not wanting for myself anything in particular.
I have a capacity for love, your well-being at my expense, and that somehow feels good to me, even though it's tremendously costly, even though I can't sustain it very long, even though I somehow know that I am greater when I do it, but I don't do it near as much as I know I should.
Just actually caring about wanting for other people. There are innate creative impulses where I don't actually need to see any. Like, I have a friend who is a savant pianist, brilliant pianist, and he almost never will play for anybody because his experience of playing is so beautiful that he doesn't want to cheapen it by having somebody else hear it and move into a performative place. And
why do people close the door when they have sex? Why don't they want to be watched?
And it just is his own communion with music itself.
Why are sacred places dark places till we have faces? C.S. Lewis's greatest novel, written with Joy Davidman, who would become his wife.
So I think there is desire that emerges from our connection to life, not just the social layer. And then even if you're doing something that I'm inspired by and I want to do something like that too, they don't have to create conflict. I can be okay with you having something and want to share it or share in that type of phenomena.
You make me want to be a better person. The vision of Jesus dying for us motivates us to want to be like him.
Yeah, okay, now I'm starting to... I have a friend, for example, who's a fantastic guitarist. And I noticed that when we play together, he doesn't play at his peak ability because he wants the pleasure of playing together to be the thing that we share. If I was a better guitarist, it would be more fun to trade things back and forth. But the danger of going out of shared experience is far greater. And so, I know the things that you are saying are true. And perhaps what I've been saying back to you could be retranslated as the transcendent beyond the proximate somatic pleasures that we have is so rarely experienced at scale.
It's not experienced at scale.
Well,
little bits in religions.
In religion. It happens. I think that in families, there are things that people don't want to share outside of the family because they bond the family.
Yeah.
But it's hard to imagine a world in which people stop coveting their own name and lights people being impressed by their car, their yacht, their house, this, that, and the other. And I think that what you're talking about,
not hard for me to imagine that.
well, this is the thing. I mean, the odd thing that I have in being the friend and the employee of a billionaire is that I sometimes get to borrow his life.
Yeah.
And he's made his.
Notice he said that's a hard thing, and that's actually deeply insightful. Again, I do a commentary here, and I want to highlight some things, but I have a lot of respect for both of these individuals, and what they're doing here is hard.
Home available to me in Hawaii, for example. And it's absolutely astounding to be in control of an asset like that. I have another friend who lent me his island year after year. But I also found that I didn't.
This dude has some friends that I've never met.
Want or need that. And that both of these gentlemen that I'm referring to were much more focused on ideas than they were on Fabergé eggs or displaying a Picasso or anything like that. Because ultimately, they found they wanted to go. Their association with me was, let's talk about things that might move the needle in human history, rather than, do you have any idea how much this bottle of wine cost?
And again, after the other video too, I thought a lot about this, about how, what did it take for someone to move the needle in human history? Well, it cost them everything. It always costs us everything. And that's in this conversation. He's talking about Andrew Yang. Well, let's say you want to run for president. Well, on one hand, there's a lot in it, but it might cost you everything. And it might cost you everything and you lose. And so why do it? Well, because especially if you've had everything, or there's something more that you want. And gosh, I wonder if there was ever a story about someone who had everything. Well, Siddhartha Gautama, he was the son of a rich man. But what if you're the son of God? Well, then you're the son of, the heir of everything. That's the think about the political, social aspect of sonship in the ancient world. And, well, read the book of Hebrews. Why did he empty himself of everything in order to what? Well, in order to actually get everything. Well, what everything do you want? It's the salvation of these wretches down here below that, as C.S. Lewis said, are stuck playing with mud pies in the backyard because they fail to imagine what a day at the beach would be like. It's because they get distracted with sex and sugar and alcohol and status and all of these things. Well then what exactly is it that our hearts desire more than anything else, and we can't even describe or put a name on it, but every now and then we can sort of imagine it. Maybe there's a soundtrack, or maybe there's an image, or maybe it's sort of modern marketing appropriations of ancient religious ideas. Thank goodness they're in public domain. Or postures or symbols, or just reinventing religion.
And remember, I was saying earlier that I think dominant paradigms co-opt psychology to define healthy psychology as supportive of the paradigm. Mm-hmm. So what I'm about to say in terms of what I think healthy psychology is not the current definition of healthy psychology. Right. It is one that would be fit to an actually viable civilization. I think psychologically healthy humans are emotionally coupled to each other. So
we're made for each other.
100%.
And people ask me, well, can't you be a Christian and not go to church? I don't know. Can you be married and... Well, that gets into, what about chivalry? Well, what about chivalry? It's longing for the ideal.
%.
So when you're happy, I'm happy. I'm stoked for you. If you're hurting, I feel that. I feel compassion and empathy. I think the worst psychology is the inversion of sadism, where I feel joy at your pain rather than joy at your joy and pain at your pain.
I think it's a French expression, is not sufficient that one succeed in life, one's friends must also fail.
Yeah, so that is a perfect statement of what is most wrong with the world, right? That is the heart of the worst part of game. But I think jealousy is one step away from sadism. Because if sadism is I feel joy at your pain, jealousy is I feel pain at your joy or your success, or envy, right?
Yeah, it's envy, not jealousy.
And
jealousy, again, this is all religious stuff. Jealousy is, I, the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God. What does that mean? Something that is properly mine. You don't want to see your children polluted by the world. That's jealousy. Envy is, I don't want your good. I want to replace you. That's at the heart of evil. That's, well, again, we just keep barking at all kinds of Christian theology in this whole conversation.
I don't think that is a psychologically healthy place for people. I think it is largely we condition this because we watch movies where we celebrate when the bad guy gets it.
Right.
And we condition the fuck out of we celebrate when the bad guy gets it, and we celebrate when our team wins and the other team loses.
But pay attention. It always happens in the movies where you just defeat the bad guy enough to win the day, and then the bad guy comes back at you, and then you kill them, and I had no other choice. That's how we do it morally in our movies, right?
So we can collectively decouple our empathy from other human beings arbitrarily so that we can then feel good in a war, supporting, when that type of dynamic occurs. And we get conditioned that second place is the first loser and all those types of things. But this is conditioning again, and conditioning of a highly neuroplastic species. So I think our intuitions are all bad if we haven't spent time really questioning these things and then also looking at cultural outliers.
What Calvinism?
Because I don't think any of this is inexorable. Is it ubiquitous? Yes. Is it inexorable? No. But I think what is ubiquitous is psychopathology.
Well, Daniel, I think what I've gotten from our conversation is that you've got a lot of examples that are at the proof of concept level of things that are underexploited. You've got an observation that we're far off the efficient frontier.
So here's this. Well, let's take all these ideas and let's talk about that, and maybe we'll have to have weekly meetings where we have one person talk to the whole group about these ideas, and then maybe in the midweek, and we'll have other little smaller groups where people will get together, and maybe all together they'll imagine that not only can we as individuals begin to overcome these, I don't even know the fancy words that they just used, to overcome these little short-term gains of sugar and pot and porn and all these little short-term gains, but we could all collectively imagine a better world where these things go on forever, and then we can have art around it, and we can have music around it, and we can have stories around it, and we can have culture around it, and we can hire people to maintain these institutions, and we'll call them pastors or whatever you want to call them. It's we've again, like Chesterton, we've turned around and we've discovered England. Chapter 2 of now we're ready for Chesterton. Chapter 2 of his book. But if it is a chief claim of religion that it spoke plainly about evil, it was the chief claim of all that it spoke plainly about good. The thing which is resented, and as I think rightly resented, is that the great modern literature of which Ibsen is typical is that while the eye that can perceive what are wrong things increases in uncanny and devouring clarity, the eye which sees what things are right is growing mistier and mistier every moment until it goes almost blind with doubt. And when I read that, I think about this. I see racism everywhere. Well, it is. I see sexism everywhere. Well, it is. I see status conspiracies everywhere. Well, they are. All of that is true. And so we're going to tear everything down so that we can get rid of I'll tell you how to get rid of the virus. Kill everybody that's got it. Yeah, but you're trying to save humanity from itself. And the really difficult thing to get at is the good. And we're trying to name it as authentic or healthy or all of these things, but it's really hard. We see the bad, but we don't quite know how we can talk about the good. If we compare, let's say, the morality of the Divine Comedy with the morality of Ibsen's Ghost, we shall see, and part of what makes Chesterton and Lewis increasingly hard to read is that these references are dated, and so we're not watching Ibsen's plays. Ibsen's plays are gone. And when you read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, so many of the people that he's referring to are gone. They're not contemporary. We don't have Slipping Jimmy here. But why is Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul? Why is this stuff such great art? How about The Sopranos? Why is it with Dr. Melfi? And should she really try to make? What does it mean to heal Tony Soprano so he can go on mobbing and killing without the inconvenient panic attacks? If we compare, let's say, the morality of the Divine Comedy with the morality of Ibsen's Ghost, we shall see all that modern ethics have really done. No one, I imagine, this is G.K. Chesterton writing in 1905, okay? It's before the First World War. No one, I imagine, will accuse the author of the Inferno of an early Victorian prudishness or a Podsnapian optimism. But Dante described three moral instruments: heaven, purgatory, and hell. The vision of perfection, the vision of improvement, and the vision of failure. Ibsen has only one: hell. In other words, again, maybe it's unfair that I do that to Eric's podcast, but hey, it's better to punch up than punch down, right? And he's got friends that loan him islands, and he's commercialized his podcast and all of those things. So he puts it out, fair game. They're trying to do something really hard, in all fairness, and good for them. Because it's much easier to point out the bad. It is often said, and with perfect truth, that no one could read the play like Ghosts and remain indifferent to the necessity of an ethical self-command. That is quite true, and the same is to be said of the most monstrous and material descriptions of the eternal fire. It is quite certain that realists like Zola, and again, I have no idea who these people are, and I could spend time and look at it, but I haven't. Like Zola do, in one sense, promote morality. They promote it in the sense in which the hangman promotes it. Does the hangman promote morality? Sure does. But he's saying that's what Ibsen's play is doing it. It's promoting morality like the hangman. What it's not giving is the vision of, again, these things that we're groping for. The transcendent, the authentic, the good, the beautiful, the true. It's these things that we can't quite grasp. It is quite certain that realists like Zola do it in one sense, promote morality. They promote it in the sense in which the hangman promotes it, and in the sense in which the devil promotes it. But they only affect that small morality which will accept any virtue as long as we do not ask them for the virtue of courage. Most healthy people dismiss these moral dangers as they dismiss the possibility of bombs and microbes. So timely right now. They dismiss these moral virtues as they dismiss the possibility of COVID being around. I can't see it. Why shouldn't I go and do that? You can watch this play out in governor's talks. And actually, Gavin Newsom on and on says, I don't want to issue these commands. I want to inspire people to meet the moment. And I'm thinking, good for you. You're doing it the right way. Yeah, we could send out the cops and be slapping people with fines. And you probably will have to do some of that. But Gavin Newsom, whatever you think of his politics, in that moment is doing the right thing. Modern realists are indeed terrorists, like the dynamiters, and they fail just as much in their effort to create a thrill. Both realists and dynamiters are well-meaning people engaged in the task, so obviously, ultimately hopeless, of using science to promote morality. In the case of the general talk of progress, again, this is 1905. In the case of the general talk of progress is indeed an extreme one. As enunciated today, progress is simply a comparative of which we have not yet settled the superlative. And when I listen to this conversation between Eric Weinstein and Daniel Schmachtenberger, we can't settle on the superlative. We're authentic, transcendent. We're using some words to try to get there. There's a vision and an image, and what we want is human beings are assassin robots, and we can't. But we have to try to do is secure the future for us. For the assassin robots? No, somehow the assassin robots must be redeemed. Well, how can we? Well, we have this problem because with sugar or with porn or with money or with status, and status is good and sugar is good and sugar has glory in it and sex has glory in it and all of these things have glory in it, but we can't hold glory. Isaiah chapter 5, the parable of the vineyard. I made a vineyard. I gave them everything. And what did they do with it? It became a place of strife. I gave them wine, and what did they do with it? They became drunk, and they fought over the wine, and they fought over the vineyard. And they read Jesus riffing on these parables in the Gospel of Matthew. They took over the vineyard, and the king of the vineyard came and didn't like it. And what do you think that king will do to those people who took over the vineyard? We meet every ideal of religion, patriotism, beauty, or brute pleasure with the alternative ideal of progress. That is to say, we meet every proposal of getting something that we know about with an alternative proposal of getting a great deal more of what nobody knows about. Progress, properly understood, has indeed a most dignified and legitimate meaning. You can listen to Tom Holland say, progress is Christian. There's progressive revelation. Jesus says to those who doubt him, if you really knew Moses, you would recognize me. That didn't make him feel very good. There's a reason they killed him. Progress, properly understood, has indeed a most dignified and legitimate meaning. But as used in opposition to precise moral ideals, it is ludicrous. So far from it being the truth that the ideal of progress is to set against that of ethical or religious finality, the reverse is the truth. Nobody has any business to use the word progress unless he has a definite creed and an iron-cast code of morals. In other words, we can sit here and we can talk about progress, but we don't even know what we're talking about. And again, I'm not trying to say anything bad about these two. They fully admit it. I mean, Eric says, I can't imagine it. That's honest. And Daniel's, I think I can. It's friends going camping. It's foretastes. And this, people, we can't believe Jesus' miracles because they were supernatural. Pay attention to Jesus' miracles. They're not just trips. Jesus' miracles are foretastes. Why, if Jesus could raise the dead with the word, and again, you don't believe that, okay, but let's just consider it in a narrative story form. If Jesus could raise the dead with the word, he could make people dead with a word. Why do we have stories of Jesus healing and multiplying loaves and fishes and making immense amounts of wine and raising people from the dead and doing all of that? And we have not one story of him doing the opposite, of taking wine and turning it into water, of taking living enemies and turning them into dead men. That's what we do. And somehow we know it's wrong. Where do we get this idea? We can kind of know the good by knowing the bad. And so we have this story of the knowledge of good and evil. And whenever I hear that story, I think, well, they knew the good and now they learn the evil. No, they didn't know good and evil. Now suddenly with the evil, they can sort of know the good, but it's hard to talk about. Well, rivalry has a part of it. Yeah, but rivalry is part of actually what makes us go. Well, there'll be sex there, but, listen to Peter Kreeft on Sex in Heaven. He says, every time they ask me about sex in heaven, I think more about sex on earth. That doesn't put me in the right direction. But we get these tastes of glory. And this is what C.S. Lewis says with this great quote about, we have these tastes of glory all over the place. And well, there's two dynamics. I'll go further than Lewis. There's two dynamics in that we have these tastes of glory, and they become stumbling blocks for us because we don't understand them sacramentally, that this thing is connecting us to another place. And again, C.S. Lewis lays all this out in Mere Christianity. Nobody has any business to use the word progress unless he has a definite creed or an ironclad code of morals. Nobody can progress. Nobody can be progressive without being doctrinal. And this is exactly what we're finding in all of the difficulties with woke religion. They're getting extremely doctrinal. I saw this begin in the mid-teens, begin this to rise. I started reading Everyday Feminism every day because I wanted to understand their creed. And I thought, these people got nothing on the Mosaic Code, really. And when if you think Jesus is extreme in the Sermon on the Mount, read what these people have to do. You want to see religion? They double down. The difficulty that they have is, imagine a world, John Lennon's song, oh gosh. Imagine a world where there's no racism. You can't. And this is part of the point that Peterson would make, because it involves preferring some people to others. Well, you can go Brave New World and say, well, never decline sex with someone. Well, I'll tell you, there's a whole group of women that are going to have lines miles long behind them, everybody waiting their turn. Well, at least now we have technology and pornography to facilitate this, so we don't wear them out. That's how we are. We can't imagine the other world. Oh, I can imagine a world without rivalry. Really? Can you imagine a world without rivalry? Also a world without caring? You need caring, but it's got to be caring in just the right way. And we can't even imagine it. Nobody can be progressive without being doctrinal. I might almost say that nobody can be progressive without being infallible. At any rate, without believing in some infallibility. For progress by its very name indicates a direction. And the moment we are in the least doubtful about that direction, we become in the same degree doubtful about progress. Never, perhaps, since the beginning of the world has there been an age that was less right to use the word progress than we. 1905, he writes that. But it is precisely about that direction that we disagree. Isn't that what politics is about? The world would be better if it'd be more kind. Absolutely. The world would be better if people were stronger. Absolutely. Can you have kindness and strength at the same time? Well, how can we find an image of someone who is kind and strong at the same time? Whether the future excellence lies in more law or less law. There's our political fight. In more liberty or less liberty. Whether property will be finally concentrated or finally cut up. Whether sexual passions will reach its sanest in an almost virgin intellectualism or in a full animal freedom. Whether we should love everybody with Tolstoy or spare nobody with Nietzsche. These are the things about which we are actually fighting most. It is not merely true that the age which has settled least what is progress is the progressive age. It is moreover true that the people who have settled least what is progress are the most progressive people in it. The ordinary mass, the men who have never troubled about progress, might be trusted perhaps to progress. The particular individuals who talk about progress would certainly fly to the four winds of heaven when the pistol shots started the race. I do not therefore say that the word progress is unmeaning. I say it is unmeaning without the previous definition of a moral doctrine, and that it can only be applied to groups of people who hold that doctrine in common. In other words, groups of people who hold it in common and are actually doing the work. Where could we find such people? Progress is not an illegitimate word, but it is logically evident that it is illegitimate for us. It is a sacred word, a word which could only rightly be used by rigid believers in the age of faith. In other words, people who actually had an idea of, here is the yardstick. Now I can measure progress. Came across a very interesting piece in Ion magazine, Is Marriage Over? And they began with the story of John Humphrey Noyce, the founder of the Oneida community. Again, I recommend Oneida, From Free Love Utopia to a Well-Set Table, because it walks through John Humphreys Noyce, the end of the 19th century, set up an entire community. We're not going to have sticky love. And, well, how could you do it? You could do it with authority and with a hierarchy. And everybody knew that with him in charge and with the elders of the community in charge saying, okay, you would like to have sex with her? Okay, that happened. And then pretty soon you had eugenics, and that happened. And what's fascinating about the stories, you watch them in a tiny way create a little society, and there's male-female equality and all of this stuff going on, and the whole thing just breaks down. And it breaks down partly because of, if you're looking around for these little tribes who are doing sex in a different way, well, none of those little tribes are living in a vacuum. What is the least amount of violence you need in order to create this beautiful vision? Well, Jordan Peterson noted, the amount of violence you needed to create the vision of the Soviet Union was quite a bit. Same with the People's Republic of China. Right now, we're getting this displayed. Well, look at China. And again, Eric Weinstein, he was also on, he's making so much stuff, I have a hard time keeping up. I shouldn't talk. He was on Joe Rogan, and I think, again, he said something that was really insightful. He said, China's trying to have it both ways and succeeding in some ways. Totalitarianism at home and making benefits of the openness of the West. And the West had better wake up to that. It's probably true. So much talk of non-rivalry. So, is marriage over? Answer me the question, what is marriage for? Now, if you read the article about sex and companionship, they do exactly where Schmachtenberger goes. Well, there's this tiny group in China that they have this whole thing, and it lays it out. It's really quite interesting. And I think, well, is that the way it should be? Well, progress can only be measured if you have a should. And about the best we do is we see all the evils and say, ooh, that rivalry, not that. Not that. Sex, yeah, sex is good, but when it gets addictive, not that. And sugar, well, sugar is wonderful. When it gets addictive, what's not that? So again, glory. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. God number one, not number two. I got them mixed up. The whole earth is full of his glory. There's glory embedded in all this stuff. What does sex produce? What is sex meant to produce? Oh boy, a lot of the Catholics are going to love this video. Same-sex marriage is supposed to produce equality. Read the article. That's where it goes. I'm old enough to remember the civil. We're gonna have civil unions, and that'll be the same. No, it's got to be the word, because marriage is supposed to, same-sex marriage, the goal of same-sex marriage is to produce equality. That's what it's about. And you can see that. You drive down the street, see a little equal sign on the back of someone's car. That's what it's supposed to produce. So again, what is marriage? Is it over? Well, I don't know. Read Brave New World. And then Rod Dreher had a very interesting article about St. Mary of Egypt. You know, the Orthodox are always a week behind. And so while the Roman Catholics and the Protestants were all doing Palm Sunday things, they have liturgy and they're talking about this St. Mary of Egypt. And it's quite a story. And Rod Dreher puts it in his blog. And it's quite a story. And it involves sex and levitation. But to listen to the story, again, read Tom Holland's Dominion. What happened? If our desires are the noise, and you hear these two almost, daring to whisper about it, and I loved when Daniel Schmachtenberger says I'm even more embarrassed to talk about this than I would be to talk about sex, because it's almost as if there's a spiritual transcendent layer that it's what we're really looking for. And the noise of the sugar and the noise of the porn and the noise of the commerce and the noise of all these things are getting in the way. And so it's blocking my ability to enjoy the heightened. So if our senses are the noise, then their senses are heightened by deprivation in order to see what is most beautiful. So the monks go out into the desert. Peak decadence. Akira the Don notes, how naked can Madonna get? Late Roman antiquity, when celibacy became the new hotness. And parents were freaking out because they had all these arranged marriages of their daughters, and that was going to help the evolutionary family business tree for everyone. And the daughters say, I'm going to marry Jesus and go into a nunnery. What about the business? What about the legacy? What about the inheritance? And of course, the Protestant Reformation comes along, and iconoclasm. Family is the new church. Monogamy is the new virginity. One speed rather than two speed. World saving is very old business indeed. So where does that leave us? Leaves us to talk, leaves us to think. And again, when I listen to conversations like this, well, religion is going away. If you listen to Eric Weinstein talk to Daniel Schmachtenberger, dare we say religious? Dare we talk about, well, let's just use other language like transcendence and spirit, and let's just use all this language so we don't have to say those other words, because we don't want to say those other words. And then just a generation or so, when your children don't have those reflexes anymore and they walk into a church and they say, oh, this is what I've been looking for. Now, don't get me wrong on the church business here. Plenty of decadence in church. The church had its day in the sun and it blew it. But again, Chesterton, it keeps coming around. Peugeot, it keeps coming around. Christianity gets decadent and dies. And as Chesterton noted, only it just seems to keep coming around again. Would I be such a particularist and not a sufficient pluralist? Well, I'm not saying that other people and other religions and other philosophies haven't discovered different truthful ideas, but I'm sort of with C.S. Lewis on this, that, well, sometimes we just keep coming around to discover the same thing. We leave England, and then we're out in the middle of the ocean, and we don't know where we are, and then we spot land, and we come back, and we see it through new eyes. We see it through new eyes. Which book of his? Is it Orthodoxy? Is it Everlasting Man? I don't remember which one, but it's not Heretics. Chapter 2 I was reading from in that. So anyway, another poorly made video. I've just wasted a certain number of your hours doing very probably useless things, but maybe some of you put it on so that my soothing voice would put you to sleep, or you have something to listen to in the car, or when you're jogging, or when you're stuck at home and you just need to find a place to not have to listen to everyone else you're sharing the isolation with. Here it is. But the main point of this is Plan B looks a lot like Plan A, and the secularism was Plan B, and now it's coming round again.